Alright, so I doubt I've covered everything that I should cover in this video, especially because it's my first video ever, basically. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and I know a lot about this game, so I can almost definitely answer them. But other than that, I am just going to get started immediately with evasive options. The most important part of Elden Ring, in my opinion, is learning how to avoid enemy attacks consistently. So pay special attention to this part of the video because it is the most important. The ways you can avoid attacks include just simply walking away from them, sprinting away from them, rolling, backstepping, guarding, parrying, jumping, and crouching. Each of these, except for crouching, are extremely important and none of them should be neglected if you're having any trouble with a boss. Much of Elden Ring is like a puzzle where you're trying to figure out which of these ingredients you need to use to actually defeat your enemy. I know personally from veterans of the series, I see way too much of a reliance on rolling. A lot of enemies in this game will punish you for rolling too much, so sometimes it's really just a good idea to strafe them and watch them very carefully. Rolling also costs way more stamina than jumping or sprinting. In a lot of linear attacks, you can simply just walk around. That's not to say that rolling is bad by any means, because it's a way to get from point A to point B while having iframes. It's also necessary to avoid some attacks. And of course, no one beats a Souls game the first try without panic rolling. Just try to keep it at a minimum and you'll do fine. Blocking is a great way to defend yourself if you don't feel like moving, or if you can't move. Depending on the shield you're using, it won't negate all physical damage, but it'll still prevent most of it. So be sure to check the stats of your shield in the equipment screen. Other than damage negation, the most important stat on your shield is the guard boost. Guard boost decides how many attacks you can take before your guard is eventually broken, and obviously the higher the number, the better. Parrying is another way to avoid attacks, but it is very high risk, high reward. It opens the enemy up for a critical attack, which I'll talk about later, but just know that that is one of the most reliable damage sources in the game. Parrying can be done against just about any enemy or boss that is holding a weapon. Some bosses require 2 or even 3 parries before they're open for the critical hit. It's very difficult to explain exactly how to parry, but just know that every time you do the parry animation, there's an invisible hitbox that the enemy's weapon collides with, and that's what triggers the parry. It's definitely something that took me multiple playthroughs to actually pick up and understand. If you fail a parry, you'll take reduced damage and increased stamina damage. So the main attacks you'll be using are light attacks, which you can do about 5 times for each weapon, heavy attacks, and then there's another charged heavy attack, which you do by holding down the button. Then backstepping attacks, rolling attacks, and crouching attacks are identical. Jumping light attacks, jumping heavy attacks, running light attacks, and running heavy attacks. And you kind of just want to mix them up while you're fighting enemies. Now, a lot of weapons actually change their moveset in a very minor way, depending on if you're holding them in one hand or two hands. Now, it can be pretty drastic, like with the straight sword, where it goes from arcing sweeps to very narrow slashes. Or it could be like a great hammer, which is about to come up, uh, where it's still just basically downward swings. The main reason why you'd want to two-hand your weapon is because you'll do more damage, but the drawbacks are that you will not be able to use your shield, and you also use more stamina. Just because you're two-handing doesn't mean you can't block though, so keep that in mind if you ever want to do a guard counter, which is done by blocking attack and then immediately hitting heavy attack. If you're not using a shield, you'll take a lot more damage depending on your character's level, but sometimes it's worth it. Now there are other abilities called Ashes of War that you can equip at Sites of Grace, And these can do a variety of things, from attacking enemies to buffing yourself to buffing your weapon to giving you invulnerability, but most of them are offensive tools. So most Ashes of War cost FP, or the blue bar in the top left, and the reason for that is because they are very powerful attacks, but the game doesn't want you to be able to spam them. Another important thing to know about them is that on some weapons they are static and cannot be changed. But if your weapon is upgraded with smithing stones, you will always be able to change the Ash of War at a site of grace. You should also know that changing your Ash of War changes the affinity of your weapon, but that's a little more complicated and we'll get into that later. Another way to deal damage are critical hits, which are very context sensitive. So a lot of humanoid enemies will get hit by them if you simply go behind the enemy and hit the light attack button. And you really do have to be super close to them before you even try hitting the button, or else it won't work. If you break an enemy's stance by hitting them in succession many times or using a very powerful attack, you'll also be able to use a critical hit, and these ones happen from the front instead of the back. When you actually use a critical attack while you're going through the animation, you're invincible, so that's another plus. Now, you really only need rolling attacks to kill anything. That's all you really need, but each attack has its own purpose for each weapon and for every boss, so experiment around with these because they will help you a lot. The only attacks left to really talk about are horseback attacks, but you won't be using these too often just because of how primitive the horseback combat is in Elden Ring, but even then it's still better than most games I've played. You only really have technically 6 attacks, but it's really 4. You've got 2 light attacks on each side, and then you've got heavy attacks on each side of the horse. And you can charge these, and while you're actually charging them, they deal damage to enemies. Now, while you're on Torrent, you won't actually be able to dodge. You can sprint and move a little bit faster, but you get 0 iframes. So when you're fighting on horseback, it is all about positioning and hitting the enemy at the right time. You also probably want to use a lot more heavy attacks and completely charge them so that when the enemy comes towards you, you can actually unleash it and deal some pretty good damage. The other tricky part of fighting on horseback is deciding if you want to use attacks on the left side of your body or the right side of your body, so pay very close attention to the enemy and decide accordingly. Other than that, horseback combat is definitely not necessary in this game, but it can make some fights easier and some fights unnecessarily difficult. It also really depends on how long and heavy your weapon is, because a slow weapon is bad for catching enemies and a short weapon is really bad at reaching them. That is every way you can attack enemies with a melee weapon, but there are a lot of spells in this game too, so while they definitely aren't required to beat the game, they do make the game more fun in some scenarios or easier. Spells in this game are split into 2 different categories: sorceries and incantations. What you're looking at right now are incantations, specifically Dragon Cult incantations. And what makes incantations so unique is just how much variety they have. I have a completely different character who only uses holy damaging incantations, and the playstyle is completely different. The stats are also very different as well. Dragon incantations, for example, take Faith and Arcane as their main damage source, whereas this holy build only requires Faith. And a little intelligence, but I forgot that part. Now, just because I like to use one damage type per playthrough doesn't mean that you have to, especially on your first playthrough. You can use flame incantations, holy incantations, and dragon incantations all on the same character, and it will work perfectly fine. But it isn't as focused, which is what I prefer. What's also unique about incantations as opposed to sorceries is that they have a lot of buffing or support qualities as well. So they're good for, some of them are used to heal, some of them are used to prevent damage, some of them are used so that you can deal more damage, some of them prevent status effects, some of them deal status effects. It's a lot more than just straight up dealing damage. Using sorceries is a lot more focused on damage, as I alluded to before. While there are spells that are capable of buffing in a way, most of your priority when playing as a sorcerer is just completely shoving these spells in enemies' faces and hitting them so many times before they can even hit you that they can barely act or even stand up. On average, sorceries are also far more damaging than incantations, and they're a lot more efficient when it comes to using FP as well. That being said, if you do just use sorceries or even if you just use incantations, your FP bar is going to dwindle really quickly. Thankfully, Elden Ring is very open to you mixing and matching your stats. So this character is a mix of intelligence and strength. So that they don't completely have to rely on their spells to get the job done. I feel like this is what most players do on their first playthrough, and it makes sense because it gives you more options in combat. It can take some trial and error to figure out what you actually want to do on your first playthrough, but that's sort of part of the fun of the game. And of course, if that sounds like too much, or you just don't really bother with spells and you don't care, there's absolutely no shame in just finding the biggest sword you can find and rolling with it. Spells, thankfully, don't really have movesets. They're just attached to catalysts, which would be staffs or seals. All you have to do is hit the corresponding button based off of which hand it is equipped in. So in this case, I hit the right bumper on my controller and the spell is cast. The only other thing I can really say about them is that some spells can be charged and some spells can't, and of course you do that by holding down the casting button. Another important thing to know is that if you hit up on the D-pad, that's how you'll switch your spells, and if you press and hold up on the D-pad, then it will go to the first spell in your spell slot. Another way of dealing damage from afar is with a bow, which work very similar to catalysts, where you just hit the bumper and then the arrow will shoot. The main draw of bows is that you can deal different damage types depending on what arrows you have equipped. Now, bows don't do a lot of damage and they take a lot of research to actually make them work, so I would not recommend a first time player use a bow as their primary source of damage, but they're great for luring enemies towards you or dispatching really weak ones quickly. There are also tons of consumable weapons in this game in the form of like throwing knives and pots. I always found knives useful for stance breaking and deflecting status effects, whereas pots are usually more for just nuking specific enemies that are weak to the element you've infused them with. Either way, consumable items like this are pretty situational and it's not a good idea to rely on them, especially because you have to craft them. Speaking of weaknesses, this is one of the lesser known parts of Elden Ring that people usually don't talk about. There are 8 damage resistances in the game: Standard, Slash, Strike, Pierce, Magic, Fire, Lightning, and Holy. Standard damage is what most weapons with straight blades like axes and swords do. It's not really bad against anything, and it definitely isn't great against anything. Slashing damage is what most weapons that are kind of curved do. It's really good against beasts and humanoids that aren't wearing any armor, and it's really bad against enemies that are wearing armor made out of thick scales or hide. Piercing attacks are used by any weapon that does any move that is remotely close to just a poking motion. And this damage type is really good against enemies that might have thick skin but really squishy insides. It's also a great damage type because any enemy that is currently attacking you receives more damage if it is hit by a piercing attack. Enemies that are made up of almost entirely hard structures are very weak to strike damage. There are a lot of enemies in the game that are almost designed for you to specifically pick up a striking damage weapon to deal with them, like the Crystallians. There are also enemies called scaled enemies, which take way more damage to strike. So if you're ever whacking an enemy and wondering why your weapon keeps bouncing off of it, it's probably because you haven't stance broken it yet, or because you're not using a striking weapon. Either way, it's not like you have to use striking weapons to beat the game, but they can be useful sometimes. The main drawback to striking weapons is that they're usually pretty heavy and slow. Magic damage is dealt with glintstone sorceries, and it isn't really bad against anything except other glintstone sorcerers, as well as certain golems that were created by using glintstone sorcery. It's pretty easy to tell what does do fire damage because it usually looks like it's on fire. And fire damage, similar to slashing damage, is really good against beasts and anything that isn't covered by armor or thick skin. Fire damage is also unique in the sense that some enemies really do not like being burned and will recoil for a while, allowing you to hit them. Lightning damage is really good against anything made of or wearing metal. It also has the unique property of just doing way more damage if it's raining or the enemy is standing in water. Enemies that are made out of stone or kind of rubbery take less damage to it though. Holy damage is widely considered one of the worst damage types because so many of the enemies from the lore standpoint would naturally resist it. That being said, it is one of the best damage types against enemies that are undead. In fact, just having holy damage on your weapons prevents certain undead enemies from resurrecting. You can see here how this enemy is just going to revive himself. So you actually have to hit him again while he's reviving. If your weapon has a sacred affinity, then you just kill them instantly. Aside from damage types, there are also status ailments. These include poison, scarlet rot, blood loss, frostbite, sleep, madness, and death blight. Now, on a first playthrough, I would only really worry about blood loss and frostbite. Blood loss is very similar to stance breaking in the sense that you need to hit the enemy a lot for it to proc. Once it's procced, the enemy will have a bloody explosion, and then the health bar will go down even more than usual. It's kind of difficult to notice, but the more you play, the more you'll be able to see it. And other times it's so obvious that you'll wonder what happened. This is because blood loss damage is calculated as a percentage of the boss's health that you're taking away. Any enemies that are undead or were never alive to begin with, like golems, completely resist bleed. Same goes for frostbite, but frostbite has the added benefit of enemies taking increased damage when it procs. You can tell it's procced when the enemy's color changes. If you do have an interest in afflicting any other status effects, it's all the same rules. All you have to do is hit the enemy multiple times without giving them any break, and eventually the status effect will proc. So it's not like you have to spec into a specific build just to access these status effects. There are pots, greases, arrows, knives, anything you can think of that you're able to craft and then afflict these. To actually craft them you need cookbooks, but I'm not going to tell you where they are because that spoils the fun. Alright, so now I'm just going to run through some miscellaneous things that I felt like were important to mention. First off, people rely on the lock-on mechanic a little too much. It can be very useful for when you're focusing on one target and just need to burst them down quickly, but when there's multiple enemies on screen, it's a very good idea to let go of the lock-on and just use the right stick to control the camera. This lets you have way more awareness of the situation. It is incredibly useful when you're fighting enemies like dragons when you need to hit their head. When you inevitably find the Flask of Wondrous Physic, do not sleep on it. It gives you temporary buffs, but they are just long enough for you to kick a boss's ass. And all you have to do is just drink a potion right before you enter the fog gate. I briefly touched on this before, but some weapons have unique ashes of war that cannot be swapped. That means that they're a somber weapon, so they're upgraded with somber smithing stones. So if it ever just says somber, don't even bother trying to switch the Ash of War. And when you do start switching around your Ashes of War more often, be on the lookout for anything called a wet blade, because it'll change the way that the weapon scales. Specifically how it scales off of your stats. It also affects things like if you can infuse it with poison, and then your weapon will have poison build up. With that, you should understand how to take out basically all of your enemies. The only other thing I have to say is that you definitely need to explore in this game. Check every nook and cranny until you're satisfied. And then one day, you may just claim the Elden Throne.